The alarm on my console screamed before my mind could catch up to what it meant. I am Vesik Oran, 3rd Fleet Intelligence Officer of the Coalition of Bound Worlds, and in 12 cycles of service, I had never seen a single ship cause an entire command deck to freeze in place. One moment, the officers around me were reviewing routine patrol reports. The next, every eye was locked on a red marker blinking at the edge of the Kesh corridor, a boundary of space we had spent 3 years trying to keep quiet. The marker had a name attached to it: Quiet Company. No fleet designation, no escort, no warning broadcast requesting safe passage, which every civilized vessel was required to send before entering contested space. It simply arrived, dropping out of translite with a stillness that felt almost insulting, as if the void itself had decided to hold its breath. I remember reaching for the comm panel to confirm the sensor reading, certain it was an error. Ships did not travel alone through the corridor. Not human ships. Not after everything that had happened along that border in the last 2 years. Every human vessel we had encountered came in formation, cautious, always trailing support craft in case of ambush. This one came with nothing, no shields raised, no weapons armed. Just a single hull sitting in open space, like it had all the time in the galaxy to wait for us to notice it. General Draith Kor entered the command deck within minutes, his boots striking the floor with the sharp rhythm of a man who had already decided how this would end. He was broad even by coalition standards, plated in the deep grey armor reserved for fleet command, and his presence alone usually settled a room. That day it did the opposite. Officers straightened, but their eyes kept drifting back to the marker on the main screen, as if daring it to move. "Report," he said, and his voice carried the particular calm of someone who expected an easy answer. I gave him what I had. A single vessel, unidentified class, no escort, no hostile posture, requesting nothing, broadcasting nothing, simply present. I watched his jaw tighten as I spoke. In coalition military doctrine, silence from an enemy vessel was worse than aggression. Aggression could be measured. Silence could not. "Scout ship," said Commander Talis Vroon from the tactical station, a woman known for her caution bordering on paranoia, which had kept half our patrols alive during the border skirmishes, testing our response time. Nothing more. "Then why hasn't it moved?" I asked before I could stop myself. Everyone turned to look at me, and I felt the familiar heat of being the newest senior officer in a room full of veterans. But the question stood. A scout ship gathered data and left. This one had been sitting motionless for nearly 4 minutes, engines idle, sensors sweeping our formation with a thoroughness that felt less like surveillance and more like patience. General Kor studied the screen a long moment before speaking again. "Hail it." The comm officer complied, and for a moment the bridge held its breath along with the void outside. Then a voice came through, low, unhurried, carrying none of the static distortion we expected from long-range human transmissions. It was almost too clear, as if the ship itself refused to let anything about this moment feel uncertain. "This is Quiet Company," the voice said, "requesting permission to dock at Coalition Station Ithra for direct communication. No weapons will be armed. No escort will follow. One representative will disembark." The bridge erupted into overlapping voices, half of them arguing this was a trap, the other half arguing that no trap in recorded history had ever announced itself this plainly. I stayed quiet, running the numbers in my head, because something about the phrasing bothered me more than the request itself. It did not sound like a plea. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a formality, the kind of message someone sends when they already know the answer will be yes. General Kor raised a hand, and the room fell silent instantly, the kind of silence that only years of discipline can produce. He stared at the marker for a long moment, weighing something none of us could see. "Deny escort protocols," he finally said. "Grant docking, full security detail at the bay. If this is deception, I want to be the one who ends it." I should have felt relief at the decision. Instead, I felt the same unease that had been building since the marker first appeared. A small, cold certainty that we were not the ones setting the terms of this meeting, no matter how much control the general believed he held. Station Ithra was not a place built for drama. It was a supply and coordination hub, functional, grey, humming with the low mechanical noise of cargo lifts and ventilation systems. That day, Every officer stationed near the docking bay stood a little straighter, weapons holstered but hands never far from them, eyes fixed on the sealed door that separated us from whatever the quiet company intended to send through. I positioned myself near the back of the security line, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid being the first face any potential threat would see. General Kor stood at the center, flanked by 2 of his personal guard, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had ended border conflicts with far less preparation than this. I found myself wondering if that confidence was earned or simply habitual, the kind soldiers wear because uncertainty is not permitted at his rank. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy mechanical groan, then silence. We waited. 10 seconds, 20. Long enough that a junior officer near me shifted his weight, and General Kor shot him a look sharp enough to still him instantly. Then the door opened. I do not know what any of us expected. A boarding party in full battle gear, perhaps, or an armored diplomat surrounded by aides reciting careful phrases designed to avoid offense. What stepped through instead was a single man in a plain gray uniform, no insignia on his shoulders, no rank markings on his collar, no visible weapon anywhere on him. He was neither imposing in size, nor unusually young or old. He looked, if anything, unremarkable, the kind of face you might pass in a crowded transit hub without a second glance. But he moved like no unremarkable man I had ever seen. He stepped onto the deck with the unhurried confidence of someone walking into a room he already owned, his eyes sweeping the assembled security detail once, calmly, the way you might glance at furniture. He did not flinch at the number of weapons trained on him. He did not raise his hands or offer the usual gestures of peaceful intent that visiting diplomats performed out of habit. He simply stood there, waiting, as if we were the ones who needed to catch up. "Name and designation," General Kor demanded, his voice carrying the edge of a man unaccustomed to being kept waiting. The man's gaze shifted to him, and for the briefest moment I saw something pass behind his eyes, not defiance, not fear, something closer to mild curiosity, the way one might look at a puzzle that had already been solved. "Daniel Ashford," he said simply. "I'm here to talk. No rank, no unit, no title, just a name, offered plainly, as though it were the only thing that mattered." General Kor's guards exchanged a glance, and I saw Commander Vroon's hand tighten fractionally on the grip of her sidearm. In all our recorded encounters with human military personnel, every individual identified themselves with rank first, name second, a habit so deeply ingrained that its absence felt almost more alarming than if he had announced himself as a weapon. "You will be searched," General Kor said, "and you will be escorted under guard for the duration of your visit." "Understood," Ashford replied, and he extended his arms without being asked, allowing the security detail to run their scanners over him with the patience of a man who had done this before, many times, in places far less comfortable than a coalition supply station. The scan came back clean, no weapons, no hidden devices, no trace of the biological or chemical agents our protocols always screened for when dealing with human visitors, given the history of incidents along less guarded borders. He was, by every measurable standard, exactly what he claimed to be, a man, nothing more. And yet as the guards fell into position around him, I noticed something that unsettled me more than any weapon could have. He did not walk like a captive being escorted. He walked like a man leading a procession, his pace set by his own rhythm rather than theirs, so subtly that it took several steps before I realized the guards had unconsciously adjusted their speed to match his instead of the other way around. I fell into step several paces behind the group as they moved toward the central conference hall, my mind cataloging every detail I could, because something told me this moment would matter far more than General Kor currently understood. A man with no rank, no escort, no weapon, walking into the heart of Coalition Command, as though he had already read the ending of whatever story we thought we were beginning. The walk to the conference hall took several minutes, long enough for whispers to spread through the station, faster than any official report could travel. By the time we reached the sealed doors, a small crowd of off-duty personnel had gathered along the upper walkway, drawn by rumor rather than authorization, watching the procession pass beneath them with the same wary fascination I felt myself. I studied Ashford as we walked, searching for any sign of tension, any tell that might betray nerves beneath that calm exterior. There was none. His breathing was even. His shoulders remained relaxed. Even the guards flanking him, trained to notice the smallest indicators of hostile intent, seemed to find nothing to report. It was as if the concept of danger simply did not register with him the way it did with everyone else in that corridor. At one point, a junior officer stumbled slightly while adjusting his weapon strap, the metal clattering against his armor loud enough to make several people flinch. Ashford did not so much as turn his head. It was such a small thing, but it told me more than any interrogation could have. Fear responds to noise. Training suppresses that response with effort. Whatever this man carried inside him required no effort at all. When we finally reached the hall, General Kaur turned to address him one last time before the doors opened. "You understand," he said, "that everything you say beyond this point will be recorded, analyzed, and used to determine the nature of your visit." "I'd expect nothing less," Ashford said, and for the first time since he had stepped off his ship, something like the faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not mockery. It was not nervousness. It looked, strangely, like relief, the expression of a man finally arriving somewhere he had been trying to reach for a long time. The doors opened, and I followed the procession inside, unaware that the next hour would unravel every assumption I had built my career on. The conference hall was already filling when we entered. Rows of seats occupied by officers summoned the moment word of the arrival spread through the station. Admirals from 3 fleet divisions sat along the upper tier, diplomatic liaisons from 2 neighboring systems occupied the side benches, and at the head of the room stood the long central table reserved for matters the coalition considered too significant for ordinary channels. I had only seen that table used twice before in my career, both times during disputes that nearly escalated into open conflict. Ashford was led to a single chair positioned near the far end of the table, separated slightly from the rest, close enough to participate, distant enough to mark him as something other than an equal. He sat without complaint, folding his hands calmly in front of him, and said nothing as the room continued to fill around him. I took my position near the recording station, along the side wall, close enough to observe every reaction in the room, far enough to remain unnoticed, which had become something of a habit in my years of service. From there I watched dozens of high-ranking officials settle into their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the quiet man at the end of the table, with expressions ranging from suspicion to open hostility. General Kaur took his seat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 senior admirals whose names I recognized from a dozen briefings on border security. He waited until the last officer had settled before speaking, his voice carrying easily across the hall without need of amplification. "We are gathered," he began, "to determine the nature and intent of an unauthorized human vessel that entered the Kesh corridor without escort, without warning, and without diplomatic clearance. The individual before us has offered a name and nothing more. I intend to change that." Several officers murmured their approval, and I noticed more than a few hands resting near sidearms beneath the table, an old habit among veterans who had survived encounters where politeness ended abruptly. Ashford remained silent through all of it, his gaze moving slowly across the room, cataloging faces the same way I had been cataloging his behavior since he first stepped off his ship. "Let us begin with the obvious question," General Kaur continued. "Why does a single human vessel enter contested space without support, without warning, and without fear?" The room fell silent, waiting for Ashford's response. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the table once more, taking in the assembled officers, the armed guards stationed at every exit, the recording devices mounted along the walls, and I had the strange sensation that he was not searching for the right words, but rather deciding how much of the truth this room had earned. "Because I was told this was the fastest way to prevent a mistake neither side can undo," he said finally. The phrase landed strangely in the room, too calm for a threat, too direct for diplomatic evasion. Several officers exchanged glances, and I saw Commander Vroon lean forward slightly, her expression shifting from suspicion to something closer to genuine curiosity. "Explain," General Kaur said. his patience visibly thinning. "I will," Ashford replied. "But you should know that some of what I say will not be comfortable to hear. I did not come here to make this meeting easy. I came here because the alternative was worse for everyone in this room, including people who are not yet in this room." I remember writing that line down word for word in my report later that night, because something about it carried a weight I could not immediately explain. It was not a threat, it was not bravado, it was the tone of a man delivering unwelcome news to people who had not yet realized how much they needed to hear it. General Corr's fingers drummed once against the table. A small gesture I had learned over the years signaled the edge of his patience. "You have 5 minutes to justify your presence here, Ashford, before I have you return to your vessel and this station placed on full alert." Ashford nodded once, calm as ever, and I felt the entire room lean forward without moving an inch, waiting for whatever came next. "3 of your patrol formations have altered their positions along the Kesh corridor in the last 9 days, he said, his voice steady, almost conversational, as if he were reciting facts from memory rather than reading them off a document. Formation 7 shifted toward the outer settlements 2 days ago. Formation 12 increased its presence near the mining colonies last night. And this morning, before I arrived, your reserve fleet at Ithra received orders to prepare for extended deployment." The room went utterly still. I felt my own pulse quicken, because those movements had not been announced publicly, not even within most departments of Coalition Command. I had access to fleet logistics through my intelligence clearance, and even I had only learned of the reserve fleet deployment an hour before the alarm sounded. "How do you know this?" General Corr said, his voice dropping into something quieter and far more dangerous than his earlier authority. Ashford met his gaze without hesitation, because someone needed to know it before it became something none of us could take back, he said. "And because I was the only one willing to fly here and say it to your face instead of letting it happen from a distance." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the station's ventilation system behind the murmurs building around the table. Every officer in that room understood, in that moment, that this man had not stumbled into Coalition space by accident, and he had not come as a scout, a diplomat, or a soldier following orders. He had come because he already knew exactly what we were planning, and he had decided to stop it before it started. It took several minutes for the room to settle after Ashford's words landed, and in that silence I found myself watching General Corr rather than the man who had just unsettled an entire chamber of senior officers. Corr's expression did not change outwardly, but something in the set of his shoulders told me he was recalculating everything he had assumed about this meeting the moment he walked in. "You will explain how you obtained classified fleet movements," Corr said finally, his voice measured but edged with something sharper than before. "I could," Ashford said, "but it would waste the time we don't have. What matters is not how I know. What matters is what happens next, and whether this room is willing to listen before deciding I'm the threat you came here expecting." A murmur rippled through the assembled officers, some clearly offended by the implication, others visibly reconsidering their earlier certainty. I noticed Commander Vroon lean back in her chair, arms folded, studying Ashford with an expression I had rarely seen her wear toward anyone, something close to reluctant respect. "You claim to have come here to prevent a mistake," Corr said, "yet you offer no proof of intent, no explanation of authority, and no indication of who sent you. Why should this council believe a single unranked man carries the weight to speak for an entire species?" Ashford's gaze did not waver. "Because nobody sent me," he said. "I came on my own judgment, and I will stand by every word of it, whether this council believes me or not." The admission seemed to unsettle the room further, rather than calm it. An officer near the back rose halfway from his seat, objecting loudly that no civilian, however calm, should be permitted to address a council of this standing without proper authorization. Others joined in, voices overlapping, until the hall filled with a rising tide of argument that drowned out any possibility of clear discussion. Through it all, Ashford remained seated, hands folded, expression unreadable, waiting with the patience of a man who had clearly sat through worse chaos than a room full of frustrated officers. It was General Corr who eventually raised a hand, silencing the chamber with the same authority that had summoned it in the first place. "Enough," he said. "We will proceed in order, or we will not proceed at all." The room quieted, though I could still feel the tension humming beneath the surface, the kind that precedes either resolution or disaster, with no room left for anything in between. I found myself gripping the edge of my recording console tighter than necessary, aware that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine far more than the fate of a single meeting. "Continue," Core said, turning back to Ashford. "But understand that patience in this chamber has limits, and you are close to testing mine." Ashford inclined his head slightly, the closest gesture to deference I had seen from him since he stepped off his ship. "Then let me be direct," he said. "Your fleet movements suggest preparation for engagement along human colonial borders. Your reserve deployment suggests you expect that engagement within days, not months. I am not here to discuss whether that assessment is accurate. I am here because if it is accurate, the outcome will be far worse for the Coalition than anyone in this room currently believes." The claim hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched several senior admirals stiffen visibly, unaccustomed to being told, by an unranked civilian no less, that their military projections were flawed. General Core's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might end the meeting entirely, dismiss Ashford as a provocateur, and have him escorted back to his vessel under heavier guard than before. Instead, he leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. "You speak with remarkable confidence for a man with no official standing," he said. "Convince me that confidence is earned, or this conversation ends now." Ashford held his gaze steadily. "I've seen what happens when careful people underestimate quiet ones," he said. "I would rather spend an uncomfortable hour explaining that to you now than watch this council learn it the hard way later." I remember the chill that ran through me at those words, not because they were threatening, but because of how utterly certain he sounded, as though he were reciting something he had witnessed firsthand, rather than warning of a hypothetical outcome. The room seemed to feel it too, because even the officers who had been loudest in their objections fell silent, waiting to hear what came next. General Core studied him a long moment, weighing something none of us could fully see, before finally leaning back in his chair. "You have my attention," he said. "Use it wisely." It was in that pause, that fragile moment of uneasy attention, granted, rather than earned, through rank or protocol, that Ashford rose slowly from his seat. The movement itself was unremarkable, the kind of small shift anyone might make to ease stiffness after sitting too long, but something about the way the room reacted told me it was anything but ordinary. Guards near the walls straightened instinctively. Officers along the table leaned back as if to create distance. Even General Core's hand drifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the edge of the table, a gesture I recognized from years of studying his mannerisms as the prelude to a command. Ashford did not reach for anything. He simply stood, calm and unhurried, and turned to face General Core directly, the two of them separated by only a few feet of open space at the head of that long table. The room seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting to see what a man with no rank, no weapon, and no official authority intended to do standing before the highest-ranking officer in the sector. I would spend the following months replaying what happened next in my mind more times than I could count, trying to understand exactly what shifted in that room during the handful of seconds that followed. Because it was in that moment, standing calmly before a general who commanded fleets capable of leveling entire worlds, that Daniel Ashford spoke 4 words that would end up rewriting everything the Coalition believed about the war it thought it was about to win. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for any weapon, real or implied. He simply looked General Draith Core directly in the eyes, with the same unshaken calm he had carried since stepping off his ship, and said the words that would later be repeated in intelligence briefings across a dozen systems, whispered among officers who had not even been present, and remembered by every single person in that hall for the rest of their careers. "Permission to talk, sir." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in over a decade of service. It was not the silence of confusion, nor the silence of fear. It was the silence of an entire room recalculating everything it thought it understood, because those 4 words did not belong to a civilian, a diplomat, or a scout. Those words belonged to a soldier addressing a superior officer, and somehow, Impossibly, this unranked man had just placed himself, without insignia, without title, without a single visible marker of authority, into a position that made General Kor himself pause before answering. I glanced around the room and saw the same realization dawning on face after face. Whoever this man was, he had not walked into our command station as a visitor seeking an audience. He had walked in as someone who already understood exactly how to speak to power, because he had once held it, or perhaps still did, in ways none of us yet understood. General Kor's hand, which had drifted toward the table moments before, went still. His eyes narrowed, not in hostility, but in the sharp focus of a man who had just recognized something he had missed entirely until that instant. The room waited, breathless, for his response, because whatever he said next would determine not just the outcome of this meeting, but the shape of everything that followed. General Kor did not answer right away. He studied Ashford for a long moment, the way a soldier studies an opponent who has just revealed a skill nobody expected them to carry. Then, almost against his own instinct, he gave a single short nod. "Granted," he said. "Speak." Ashford did not rush. He let the permission settle in the room first, let every officer present absorb what had just happened, before he began. "9 days ago," he said, "your reserve command received a projection model estimating human colonial population growth along the outer settlements. That projection was flagged as a security concern by 3 separate departments. I know this because the model itself was flawed, and I know it was flawed because I have seen its predecessor used before, on a different border, against a different people, with consequences that took years to undo." A murmur spread through the hall, quieter this time, more measured, the kind of reaction that comes from people trying to process information rather than reject it outright. General Kor's expression remained unreadable, but I noticed his fingers had stopped drumming against the table entirely. "You are suggesting this council has misjudged the threat posed by human expansion," Kor said. "I am telling you that fear built from incomplete information tends to justify itself," Ashford replied. "Your analysts see population growth and read it as a prelude to invasion. I have read the same reports. The growth is real. The intention behind it is not what your models assume." One of the senior admirals, a stern woman named Ilira Voss, who had overseen border security for longer than I had been alive, leaned forward with open skepticism. "And what would you have us believe instead?" she asked. "That an entire species expanding at this rate poses no danger to established coalition worlds? I would have you understand the difference between growth and aggression," Ashford said. "My people did not send warships to your border. We sent families, engineers, farmers, people building lives on worlds nobody else claimed. Somewhere along the way, someone decided that growth alone was reason enough to prepare for war." The room fell into an uneasy quiet. I found myself thinking of the briefings I had sat through over the past year, the careful phrasing used by coalition strategists when discussing human colonization, the subtle framing that treated every new settlement as a potential staging ground rather than what it actually was, ordinary people building ordinary lives on the edge of known space. "You speak as though you have access to strategic assessments reserved for the highest levels of coalition command," General Kor said. "That alone should concern this council more than anything else you have said today." "It should," Ashford agreed, without hesitation. "But not for the reason you think. I do not have spies embedded in your command structure, General. I have something far simpler. I have people who have learned to listen carefully to patterns, because patterns are often louder than words, if you know what to watch for." "Explain," Kor said. "Formation movements along a border rarely happen for administrative reasons," Ashford said. "When 3 separate formations shift within 9 days, in directions that converge rather than diverge, it tells a story regardless of what official orders claim. I did not need access to your command network to see it. I only needed to watch, the way any careful observer watches weather before a storm." I glanced toward Commander Vroon and saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of reluctant understanding, because she herself had once taught junior officers, myself included, to read exactly those kinds of patterns during tactical training. It was uncomfortable to hear the same principle used against the very command structure that had trained us to recognize it. Even if your reading is accurate, General Kor said, you have not explained why a single unranked individual took it upon himself to fly into contested space and deliver this warning personally, rather than allowing official channels to manage the matter. Ashford was quiet for a moment, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, I saw something behind his calm exterior that looked almost like weariness, the kind carried by people who have delivered difficult truths more times than they cared to count. Because official channels move slowly, he said, and mistakes made in a hurry rarely wait for slow solutions. I have seen conflicts begin because two sides each assumed the worst about the other, and neither wanted to be the first to ask a simple question before it was too late to matter. I decided to ask the question instead of waiting for someone else to decide it wasn't worth asking. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones, heavier, with something that resembled genuine consideration rather than suspicion. General Kor sat back slowly, his gaze fixed on Ashford with an intensity that suggested he was recalculating far more than the tactical situation at hand. You claim no formal rank, Kor said finally. Yet you address strategic matters with the confidence of someone who has commanded fleets far larger than this station's entire garrison. Explain that contradiction, or I will assume you are exaggerating your own importance to manipulate this council. Ashford's gaze did not waver. I did not say I have never held rank, he said quietly. I said nobody in this room currently knows what rank I hold, and that is a very different thing. The words landed like a small detonation across the hall. Officers exchanged glances, and I felt my pulse quicken as the implications settled over the room. If this man had once held command authority significant enough that even a coalition general could sense it without being told, then everything about this meeting needed to be reconsidered from the ground up. Then tell us, General Kor said, his voice lower now, almost private despite the size of the chamber. Tell this council exactly who you are, and why humanity sent someone like you instead of a formal delegation. Ashford held his gaze for a long moment, and I could sense the weight of a decision passing behind his eyes, the kind of choice made only once certain conditions have finally been met. Humanity didn't send me, he said. I came because I was the only one who could reach you in time, and because some decisions are too important to leave in the hands of people who have never had to live with the outcome of getting them wrong. He paused, letting the words settle, before continuing in a voice quiet enough that the entire hall leaned in to hear it clearly. My rank stopped mattering to the people who served with me a long time ago, he said. They didn't follow me because of insignia on my shoulder. They followed me because of what I did the last time silence was mistaken for surrender, and I intend to make sure that mistake is not repeated here. The hall fell utterly still, and in that silence I understood, for the first time since the alarm had sounded hours earlier, that we were no longer dealing with a diplomatic incident or a security threat. We were dealing with something the coalition had never properly accounted for in any strategic model, a man whose authority came not from title, but from history so significant that rank itself had become irrelevant to those who remembered it. General Kor studied him for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of its earlier command. It carried, instead, the quiet unease of a man beginning to understand that the war he believed the coalition was prepared to win had already been shaped by forces far older and far more dangerous than any fleet movement could measure. Then tell this council, he said slowly, exactly what history you carry, Mr. Ashford. Because if even a fraction of what you imply is true, this meeting is no longer about border settlements. It is about survival. Ashford's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, the subtle stillness of a man preparing to speak about things he had hoped never to discuss again. Then let me start, he said, with the last time a fleet like yours assumed silence meant weakness. The room, already tense, seemed to draw even tighter around those words, as though every officer present sensed that whatever came next would change the way the coalition understood humanity forever. Ashford began speaking, and as he did, I noticed something curious happening around the table. Officers who had spent the earlier part of the meeting whispering objections now sat perfectly still, pens hovering over data pads, eyes fixed entirely on him. Even General Kor, A man not easily moved by rhetoric leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch every word before it left the speaker's mouth. There was a colony, Ashford said, far from any border you have ever charted, made up of people who had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. When a hostile force arrived assuming they were undefended, the assumption cost that force everything. I was there, not as a commander sent by any government, but as one of the people who had to decide, in the space of a single night, whether we would wait for orders that would never come in time, or act on our own judgment. He paused, and I could see the memory settling behind his eyes, not performed for effect, but genuinely present, the kind of weight only real experience carries. We chose to act, he continued, and when it was over, the survivors on both sides understood something that no treaty could have taught them. That silence from people who have nothing to prove is far more dangerous than noise from people trying to convince you of their strength. General Corps' voice, when it came, was quieter than before. You are describing an unofficial engagement. There is no record of any such conflict in Coalition archives. There wouldn't be, Ashford said. It happened outside any territory your sensors reach, involving people your census never counted, against a force that no longer exists, to file a report. History does not always leave paperwork behind. Sometimes it only leaves survivors, and the habits they carry afterward. I watched Commander Vroon's hand drift toward her datapad, already composing a request to cross-reference decommissioned hostile forces along uncharted human expansion routes, and I made a note to submit the same inquiry the moment this meeting ended. You still have not explained your rank, General Corps pressed, though his tone had shifted from demand to something closer to genuine curiosity. Because rank stopped being the right question a long time ago, Ashford said. After that night, the people who survived didn't care what title I held. They cared that I hadn't waited for permission when waiting would have meant losing everyone. Word travels among people who have lived through something like that. It travels further than official records ever do, and it carries more weight than insignia. An admiral near the end of the table, a heavy-set man named Corvin Thale, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke, his voice carrying the gravel of someone who had spent decades assessing threats. You are asking this council to believe that your authority comes from reputation alone, built outside any recognized command structure. That is not how authority functions in any civilization I am aware of. It is exactly how authority has always functioned, Ashford replied, without hesitation. Titles are given by governments. Trust is given by people who have watched you make the right choice when it mattered most. I would rather carry the second kind, even without a title to prove it. The hall remained quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that comes not from confusion, but from an entire room being forced to reconsider assumptions built over years of careful strategic doctrine. I found myself thinking of every briefing I had ever attended, describing humanity as unpredictable, disorganized, dangerous, precisely because they lacked the rigid command structures the Coalition relied upon. For the first time, I began to wonder if that unpredictability was not a weakness at all, but something closer to a different kind of strength, one built on judgment rather than hierarchy. If what you say is true, General Corps said finally, then the fleet movements you warned us about were never going to remain a secret from people like you, regardless of how carefully we planned them. No, Ashford said simply, they were not. Then why come here at all? Corps asked. If you already understood our intentions well enough to predict them, why not simply prepare a defense and let events unfold as they would? Ashford's expression shifted then, something quieter and more personal crossing his features before he answered. Because I have seen what happens when both sides prepare for the worst instead of speaking first, he said. I have stood over the results of that choice, and I decided a long time ago that I would rather risk looking foolish, walking into a room full of armed officers, than risk watching another night like the one I already lived through. The honesty in his voice seemed to land harder than any tactical argument could have, and I noticed several officers exchanging glances that carried something closer to reluctant respect than suspicion. Even General Corps, who had entered this meeting fully prepared to treat Ashford as a threat to be contained, now studied him with the careful attention of a man reconsidering an opponent he had badly underestimated. Then let this council understand you clearly, Kor said. You are telling us that despite holding no official rank, despite representing no formal government authority, you carry enough trust among your own people that they allowed you to fly here alone, unarmed, into a station filled with weapons trained on you, simply because you judged it the right thing to do. Yes, Ashford said. And you expect this council to accept that as sufficient reason to halt a military preparation built on months of strategic planning? I expect this council to consider, Ashford said, that the people who taught me to make decisions like this one have made far more of them than any strategic model your analysts have built. And every time we chose to speak first instead of striking first, the outcome was better for everyone involved, including people who never knew how close they came to a different result. General Kor sat back slowly, his expression unreadable, the silence stretching long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system once again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard him use before, not command, not authority, but something closer to the careful tone of a man forced to reconsider everything he believed about the war he had been preparing to fight. Then explain to this council, he said quietly, exactly what happens next, if we choose to listen, instead of proceeding as planned. Ashford held his gaze steadily, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, I saw the faintest trace of something that might have been hope behind his calm exterior. Then we spend the next hour talking, instead of the next decade fighting, he said. And for the first time in longer than either of us would like to admit, nobody has to find out the hard way what happens when patience finally runs out. The meeting continued long after the initial shock of Ashford's words had settled into something the council could actually work with. General Kor called for a brief recess, and I watched him step away from the table with Admiral Voss and Admiral Thale, their voices low, their expressions tight with the particular strain of leaders, forced to reconsider a plan they had spent months building. I remained near the recording station, watching Ashford sit quietly at the far end of the table, unbothered by the scrutiny of dozens of officers who had not yet decided whether to trust him. When the council reconvened, the tone in the room had shifted noticeably. The earlier hostility had not vanished entirely, but it had been tempered by something more cautious, more deliberate, the kind of attention given to a problem that could no longer be solved with simple force. General Kor took his seat once more, studying Ashford for a long moment before speaking. This council has reviewed the fleet movements in question, he said, and while I am not prepared to admit fault publicly, I am prepared to authorize a temporary halt to further deployment while a formal dialogue is established with human colonial leadership. A ripple of surprise moved through the room, quiet murmurs of officers who had clearly not expected such a concession from a man known for his unwavering commitment to strategic caution. Ashford inclined his head slightly, the same small gesture of respect he had offered earlier. "That is more than I expected to achieve today," he said. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Kor replied. "This council will require verification of everything you have claimed, through channels this council trusts, before any permanent agreement is considered. You have bought time, Ashford. Nothing more." "Time is often all that is needed," Ashford said. "Wars rarely start because two sides disagree. They start because neither side gave the other enough time to explain why they were afraid in the first place." I found myself writing that line down as well, aware even in the moment that it would become one of the most quoted statements to come out of that meeting, repeated in briefings and reports across the sector in the weeks that followed. It was simple, almost painfully so, yet it captured something the coalition's entire strategic doctrine had failed to account for in years of border tension. As the meeting drew toward its close, Admiral Voss, who had remained skeptical throughout much of the exchange, finally addressed Ashford directly. "You have not yet told this council your rank," she said, "formally or otherwise. If we are to establish any lasting communication with your people, we will need to know who we are actually speaking with." Ashford considered the question for a long moment before answering. "My people call me by name now," he said, "not by title. It has been that way for longer than most of them can remember, because the rank I once held stopped being relevant the moment the people who served under it decided loyalty mattered more than hierarchy. If this council wants to understand who I am, I would encourage you to look not at what I was called, but at what I did when nobody was watching to see if I did it correctly. The answer did not fully satisfy the room, and I could see it in the faces around the table, officers accustomed to precise classifications, struggling to place a man who refused to be filed neatly into any category they understood. But something about his honesty seemed to carry more weight than any formal title could have provided, and I noticed even General Core nodding slowly, as though beginning to accept an answer he would never have tolerated from anyone else. The formal proceedings ended shortly after, with General Core authorizing a temporary diplomatic channel and assigning a small team, myself included, to begin verifying the claims Ashford had presented. As the room slowly emptied, officers filing out in quiet clusters, murmuring among themselves about everything they had just witnessed, I remained behind, watching Ashford gather himself to return to his ship. He caught my eye briefly as he passed, and for a moment I expected nothing more than a polite nod, the kind exchanged between strangers who happened to share a significant experience. Instead, he paused. "You were the one who questioned the scout ship theory earlier," he said. It was not a question. I admitted, surprised he had noticed me at all among the dozens of officers present. "Good instinct," he said. "Most people in that room saw a single ship and assumed weakness. You saw a single ship and asked why it wasn't behaving like one." Before I could respond, he continued toward the docking bay, flanked once more by his security escort, leaving me standing there with the strange sensation that I had just been evaluated by someone far more perceptive than his calm demeanor had suggested. I would spend the following days turning that brief exchange over in my mind, wondering exactly how much this man had noticed about all of us during the hours he had spent in that hall. The days that followed the meeting were unlike anything I had experienced in my career. Reports filtered in slowly at first, then in a steady stream, as verification teams across 3 departments began cross-referencing everything Ashford had claimed. The fleet movements he described matched precisely with internal logistics reports that had never been publicly circulated. The strategic assessments he criticized were found, upon deeper review, to contain exactly the flaws he had identified, built on population growth models that failed to account for basic differences between colonial expansion and military buildup. More unsettling still were the fragments of history my own team began uncovering, quiet references buried in decommissioned intelligence files, mentions of an unrecorded conflict along uncharted human expansion routes that matched, almost exactly, the story Ashford had told the Council. No official records existed, just as he had said, but enough secondary evidence surfaced, salvage reports, decommissioned equipment matching unfamiliar hostile designs, scattered testimonies from traders who had passed through that region years earlier, that even the most skeptical analysts on my team began to accept that something significant had indeed occurred. I remember sitting in my quarters late one evening, reviewing the accumulated evidence with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with fear of an enemy, and everything to do with the uncomfortable realization that the coalition had spent years building strategic doctrine around an incomplete understanding of the people it considered a potential threat. We had measured humanity by population growth, resource acquisition, and territorial expansion, the same metrics we used to assess every other species we had encountered. We had never accounted for the possibility that judgment, patience, and quiet resolve might matter more than any of those numbers. General Core summoned me personally 3 days after the meeting, a request that surprised me, given my relatively junior standing within the intelligence division. I found him alone in his office, studying a datapad with the same intensity I had seen him direct toward Ashford during the council meeting. "You submitted a report questioning our initial assessment of the vessel before it even docked," he said, without preamble. "I did, sir. Why?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Because it didn't behave like a scout, sir. Scouts gather information and leave." That ship sat still, waiting, as though it already knew what our response would be before we made it. Core studied me a long moment, then set the datapad down. "I have spent 30 years building strategic assessments based on measurable indicators," he said. "Fleet strength, resource allocation, territorial patterns." Ashford walked into this station and dismantled every one of those assessments, using nothing but patience and honesty. I do not know yet whether that makes him the most dangerous individual this coalition has encountered, or the only one who might have prevented a war neither side could have survived cleanly. I did not have an answer for him, and I suspect he did not expect one. Continue your verification work, he said finally. I want to understand exactly who we are dealing with before this council makes any further decisions regarding human colonial expansion. Yes, sir, I said, and turned to leave, though something made me pause at the door. Sir, if I may ask, do you believe him about everything he said? Kor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the datapad without truly seeing it. I believe, he said slowly, that a man capable of walking unarmed into a room full of weapons, addressing a general with the calm authority of someone who has genuinely earned it, and dismantling months of strategic planning using nothing but careful words, is not a man this coalition can afford to misjudge twice. I left his office that day carrying a weight I had not expected to feel, the growing understanding that everything the coalition believed about humanity, built over years of cautious observation and careful strategic modeling, had just been quietly and thoroughly rewritten by a single man who refused to raise his voice, refused to carry a weapon, and refused to let silence be mistaken for surrender. In the weeks that followed, the temporary diplomatic channel Kor had authorized grew into something more substantial, careful negotiations, conducted not through formal government representatives, but through individuals recommended, quietly and without explanation, by Ashford himself. Each one carried the same unshaken calm, the same willingness to speak plainly rather than posture, and each one left coalition officials with the same unsettling realization that had first taken hold in that council chamber. Humanity had not sent its weakest voice to negotiate on the edge of contested space. It had sent someone willing to walk directly into danger and speak first, because the alternative had already cost too much once before. I never learned Ashford's true rank, not through any official record, not through any archive my clearance eventually allowed me to access. I came to understand, over time, that it did not matter. What mattered was the quiet lesson the entire coalition eventually absorbed from that single encounter, one that reshaped strategic doctrine far beyond the Kesh corridor and rippled outward into every future negotiation involving human colonial worlds. The lesson was simple, and it was this: a species that measures strength only in fleets and weapons will always misjudge a species that measures strength in patience, and by the time the mistake becomes obvious, it is often too late to undo the damage it has already caused. The coalition had built its doctrine on numbers, and numbers had nearly led an entire sector into a war built on nothing more than fear of the unknown. Instead, a single man had walked calmly into the heart of coalition command, asked for nothing more than permission to speak, and in doing so, prevented a conflict that could have consumed both our peoples for generations. I think of that moment often, the quiet stillness in that hall, the 4 simple words that stopped an entire military council in its tracks, and I understand now that the true nightmare the galaxy feared was never human aggression at all. It was human patience, tested for years, quietly enduring, and finally, calmly, choosing to speak before it chose anything else. And once that patience had finally been spent in service of peace rather than conflict, every civilization watching from the shadows of that encounter understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what they had been dealing with all along.